White silence is violence. Black parents regular hitting and yelling, just how they/we do it. Hashtag Black Powerless. Hashtag Peaceful Parenting Matters. So I've been seeing some certain observations, and I have a previous video talking about this, a question for white people or certain people in the white community who talk about Black Lives Matter and things like this, that say the actions that were done by white people in the past have a bigger effect on the current situation for black people in the United States of America and whoever they refer to as black in the entire world. They say they are important. Some of them even go to the point where you have these sickening, pathetic, pandering videos by these celebrities coming in and be like, oh, we take responsibility. We do this for that. We're not going to be silent. We're going to be allies. It's something that really gets to me a bit. So let me just come back and just try to be a little more. I'm going to have this as part of my series on Black Lives Matter. I have a series on analyzing what I think Black Lives Matter movement is. So it's going to be a video in that series. It's called Black Lives Matter. There's at least 4 videos in that one. That previous video that I mentioned is part of that. And you can go in and check that out to see some of the background stuff I'm talking about in this. And I'll also put this in my Hands Up Don't Hit series. That is a series about peaceful parenting and the importance I think that has. And today I'm going to be reading you 2 things that I found that I think are important in this. And I'm going to be reading a meme that I made, and then this article from the American Psychological Association about corporal punishment in black communities. So first, let me just put the meme on the screen, because these are just general observations that I'm making. And this is the meme. I think this is from iCarly or something, but I really like this meme template with that interesting thing. There's many interesting things you see about this. So me watching a community that praises and prescribes the use of force in parenting, protest and riot about how authorities using force is a sign of systemic brutality. And then that person saying, interesting. Because this is the thing. You look at the basic things that are being done that people are saying are police brutality from authority figures, and I think this is a key part of it. This is what I said. I think there is a projection in African American communities, black communities in the United States of America, from the abuse that they've received as children, from the adverse childhood experiences, to the authority figures in the greater society. They also have a very high welfare dependence. So there's a situation where they feel this dependence, where that is the parent that takes them on. This is the parental figure. This is the person who's supposed to protect them. Police forces are most of the police forces are men. And then many of these people come from families that don't have men present. You get to the situation where you're put in this situation where your parent is abusing you, is using corporal punishment, is yelling, is using this force, and then you get to this place where you're an adult and that is your interaction with authority figures. Like, why are you abusing me? Why did you leave me alone in this environment? Why are you hurting me in this way? I expect protection. I want some certain protection from you, yet you come at me with this yelling way, yet you ignore me, the ignore is more part of the white supporters and things like that, because they also have a different form of adverse childhood where they're not actually, people aren't paying attention to them. So now they're just like, hashtag this, hashtag that, white silence is violence, you must be heard, silence is violence. Ignoring, neglecting a child is a form of violence, is a form of abuse to that child. That is also there, and I think that is what some people in different communities actually do. And also that is a form of not being peaceful. It's not necessarily a violation of the non-aggression principle, I would say, but it's not necessarily direct force, but there is some kind of abuse in that situation of neglecting a child. And I think in certain environments, certain communities, certain cultures, in developed countries, the amount of time the parents actually spend with the children is very low. So there is just that aspect where that is one of the things. And another one that I'm going to put up on the screen right here, and where I just don't get sometimes when I start talking about these things. And this is another related one. I went in and I looked, and I was looking at blacks lead at 14 in 1,000 reported U.S. child abuse victims, and are overrepresented in the 500 filicides a year. And imagine if folks protested that. Filicides is specifically when somebody kills a child of theirs. You're killed by your parent. So that's 500 of them, of the filicides. It was a high percentage. I tried to look at some statistics, and I think the statistics I found were in 2014. My math was not be completely 100% correct, and this is only reported. There's disappearances, there's other situations of abuse. So reported child abuse victims, 14 in 1,000. And with the culture, there is something about black culture. Oh, you got to whoop them kids. You got to do this. We'll give them the whoopings and all this thing. Oh, if you spare, that's part of the culture. It's indicative of that culture. It's been shown that women are more likely to hit children than men for various reasons. Men might yell and do other things like that, and this could also just be because women are just around more. But I think they actually have. It's hard to control for this because if you're around a child 20 hours a day versus if you're around a child 2 hours a day, and then you count like, okay, the average of that time, the accumulated time it's different. So there's different things that go with this kind of things, and the stressors and the connections that you have and all these things. But it's a tough situation when you get into this because that child has been inside your womb, is developing, there's some kind of awareness, and you get out into the world, and then there's violence. We talked about the horrific, continual, brutal practice of circumcision, of child genital mutilation that goes on in the United States of America in many communities, and it just other things that happen with abuse, the yelling. You go from that kind of situation where everything is cared for, then you put in this situation where now you start creating these bonds to these people and these individuals in certain environments that are not really that conducive. And still we're living in times that are, if you listen to this, chances are it's you have more access to resources, more access to safety, and more access to information than in 99% of human history, or for most humans even living today. But you have that. I post that, and then somebody posts, why not both? Uh, what? I'm talking about something else. What? Why not both? Like this is actual figures. The actual numbers of people being harmed in this is a lot more than any numbers that are being provided for the things that people are actually protesting about. So some of these things are just the deflecting, and I'm wondering, why don't people talk about this? Why is it such a tough thing? And I might have the answer because we've been through this as cultures, as societies. I'd been through certain experiences in my childhood. Other people have. So when you bring these things up, the hackles come up, the defense comes up, and that happens, and it's an unfortunate thing. So let's get to the article from the American Psychological Association. Corporal punishment in black communities, not an intrinsic cultural tradition, but racial trauma. Insights into the Historical Roots of African Parenting by Stacy Patton, PhD. A 2015 Pew Research survey found that black parents are more than twice as likely as white and Latino parents to use corporal punishment on a regular basis, and they are far less likely to never spank their children. But while hitting children is prevalent in black communities, contrary to popular belief, it is not an intrinsic cultural tradition. Black parents have legitimate fears about the safety of their children, and the overwhelming majority believe physical discipline is necessary to keep black children out of the streets, out of prison, and out of police officers' sight. And far too many parents argue that whooping children is a distinctly black tradition. This belief, however heartfelt, is wrong. So this is the thing. This is something that I've talked about, is out there in the culture. It's something that seems to be there in comedy shows and stand-up things. You see this on TV shows. You see this being talked about. If you have black friends, or if you actually are in the black community, I think it's something that's discussed. So let's see how she says it, how this unfolds. I haven't read this before. Some of these things I just get the title and I'm like, okay, this should be interesting to read. And yeah, so let's see if she explains how it's not a tradition, because it seems to be widespread. If it's twice as more likely as whites and Latinos, why is that the case? Do you have any thoughts on it right now without actually me reading more? Just have them in your mind or anything. Okay, so getting back into the reading. Adverse impact. Black children are more likely to be assaulted, seriously injured, or killed by a family member than by the police or a neighborhood watchman. Yearly statistics show that black children are mistreated and killed at significantly higher rates than white and Latino children. Example, Department of Homeland, DHHS. I don't know if that's Department of Homeland of House. I don't know what that stands for. DHHS of 2016. Ample scientific evidence demonstrates the long-term damage resulting from physical punishment. For example, Coley, Call, and Carano in 2014. Even without marks, or other serious physical injuries. Black parents who hit their children not only risk drawing the attention of child protective services, who are overrepresented in communities of color, but also having their children placed in foster care, which is a pipeline to the juvenile justice system, and similar adverse paths that disproportionately impact black youth. Indeed, black children stay in foster care longer and often don't receive adequate therapeutic services. It's from Fluke et al. Um, 2011. I think I'm going to stop actually reading the sources, but it seems to be a well-sourced article. So I shall leave a link to this. So if you actually want to actually read this and get to the links and see the actual reports and things that are actually being referred to for this, you can get to that. I think it's good to have these resources. The goal for black parents to protect, care for, and love black children. I'm going to pause here because this is something I feel I have to reiterate whenever I'm talking about this topic of peaceful parenting, even Black Lives Matter in general. I think majority of human beings and majority of people who support Black Lives Matter are also human beings. Even those celebrities who I was mocking at the start, they are trying to help. But I think the problem is not what X is. The problem is how we define X. And then if you define X in a way that's not accurate, the solutions you propose are not going to be okay. So I do think parents want to help kids. I don't think kids were hit more in the past because parents loved kids less in the past. No, they just didn't have better ways of doing things, and there are better ways of doing things now. Just like the police, in general, I think most of the police are trying to do a good job. Now, the rules and regulations that they have and the system that they're in might have certain issues that actually lead to this actual problems. And I think I also read this thing about systemic versus systematic after this, just to get some added input into what those two different things actually mean. So this will be a bit long. I think this is going to be about a 20-minute video. So anyway, so back into the reading. The goal for black parents to protect, care for, and love black children should not inadvertently facilitate the flow of our young people through racist systems, but rather support healthy development and success later in life. Experts in child development and parenting practices affirm no solid science suggests that hitting children to any extent and regardless of race or ethnic background is beneficial for them in society. Let me repeat that. Experts in child development and parenting practices affirm no solid science suggests that hitting children to any extent and regardless of race or ethnic background is beneficial for them or society. While many black parents hit to keep their kids from turning bad, it is clearly not working because black children disproportionately suffer negative outcomes in education achievement, juvenile arrests, and foster care placements. This type of family violence might actually be contributing to the negative outcomes that parents and caretakers were seeking to avoid. So I think that's very important to be in mind. And she said our community. So Stacey Patton is somebody who does identify as black. Historical roots of corporal punishment in black communities. Psychologists could lead in educating communities of color about the connection between corporal punishment and the racial disparities connected to the practice. But first, the profession can benefit from a better understanding of the historical roots of corporal punishment in black communities. African Americans adopted the practice of beating children from white slave masters. Patton 2017. That's from her. Okay, so just a small aside here, and I'll try to just read through this without actually getting into much of the contention. And she might address that in there, but we've been hitting kids. I mean, hitting kids. The sort of hitting of kids that I've seen in the United States of America and heard of is pales in comparison to just the average sort of hitting of kids that happens here in Kenya, from stuff that I've heard that has happened to relatives and things like that, and relatives and family members and friends and things like that. I still see kids being hit in public, just in open grocery stores. It's not as much as when I was a kid, when I was seeing, but it's happened. It's happened a few times, years. But yeah, it still happens. I don't go out that much anymore. But anyway, so that's a thing, and so I don't necessarily know if they're saying somehow white people with the West African slave trade, when that involvement came back and that somehow seeped out to Eastern Africa, or maybe they're saying East Africans learned it from being involved in the Arab slave trade. No, but I think hitting kids has been a thing because I talked about a separate video also how there's also some kind of different child abuse in Japan, where there's also sort of adverse childhoods and situations that happen in that culture, in that society. So it's a complicated topic, but let me get back to the reading. African Americans adopted the practice of beating children from white slave masters. Europeans brutalized their own children for thousands of years prior to crossing the Atlantic to the New World and colonizing Africa. Historians and anthropologists have found no evidence that ritualistic forms of physical discipline of children existed in pre-colonial West African societies prior to Atlantic slave trade. Atlantic West African societies held children in a much higher regard than slave societies in the Atlantic world, which places emphasis on black bodies as property and not as human beings. West Africans believed that children came from the afterlife, that they were gods or reincarnated ancestors who led profoundly spiritual lives and held extraordinary mystical powers that could be harnessed through ritual practice for the good of the community. In fact, it was believed that coercion and hitting a child could scare off their soul. Indigenous people of North America held similar beliefs. As colonization, slavery, and genocidal violence made life harsher for these groups, parenting practices also grew harsher. Whooping children is not a cultural practice that Africans brought with them to this continent. Historians estimate that about 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World before 1865, and about one quarter of the captives who crossed the Atlantic were children. Defined as anyone shorter than 4 feet 4 inches, the average age of captives was between 15 and 20 years old. At the beginning of the 19th century, but dropped between 9 and 2, but dropped to between 9 and 12 when abolition of slave trade was imminent. See Dipty, 2016. Okay, I'm not going to read those things I said. So the fact that the majority of captives were young is significant to our understanding of the evolution of African American childbearing practices. Bringing over mostly youth, coupled with the violent suppression of West African cultural practices, meant that traditional African child rearing practices faded the same way African languages and religious practices ultimately did. Had the slaves who crossed the Atlantic been mostly adults from the same tribes and nationalities, spoken the same languages, shared the same blueprint for child rearing, and that was practiced in the societies where they were enslaved, and then given freedom to rear their children without interference from whites, then maybe traditional African child rearing practices could have been preserved. But none of these conditions prevailed. Consequently, to argue that whooping children was a tradition brought over from Africa or that it is culturally consistent practice today is simply false. Once in America, slaves as parents were under tremendous pressure to shape their children into docile field workers and to teach them proper deference and demeanor in front of whites. Child deaths, brutal whippings and torture, sexual abuse, and being sold away from their relative for the rest of their lives were constant features of plantation life. After slaves were emancipated in 1865, yet still not free, the rules of racial etiquette and the ritualistic beatings continued as a new kind of coercive Southern labor system emerged that depended on black child workers. Again, whites co-opted black parenting to make sure it performed the same kind of function in freedom that it had during slavery. With the sanctioning of the black church, black parents enacted the master's lash to instill obedience. Their reasoning was simple. Prepare black child to deal with the chronic stresses that they would face to keep them alive. If black people had the luxury of 20 to 30 years after slavery, able to parent without fear of lynch mobs, indiscriminate police violence, and unyielding racist discrimination, then perhaps the practice of whooping might have become less widespread. But when you belong to a group of people who are in constant fear for their lives and those of their children, then it is understandable how the trauma can cause parents to interpret cruelty as love, protection, and responsible parenting, even when proven counterintuitive. So the use of corporal punishment in black communities today is a byproduct of centuries of slavery. The racial terrorism of the Jim Crow era and the exposure to racism that continues to chip away at the vitality of black life. Black parents have been encouraged to be part of the dehumanization process of the black children since before America's founding. Therapists should become conversant on how racial trauma, poverty, chronic stress, and internalized racism have left children of color vulnerable to family violence. We cannot have discussions about corporal punishment in black communities without talking about history. Okay, so there's something here. It says implications for professionals. This seems to be something that is towards. So let me just give some thoughts on what was said there. As I mentioned, she didn't really address too much of the stuff that happens in East Africa. She talked about accurately how the Europeans had been doing it to their kids as well. Did she say that all of a sudden when this happened to when the slaves were brought over, and that thing is one specific. The way people were moved from Africa, from Western Africa, established a brand new tribe of people that were intermingling racially, and the tribes were cut down. The culture had to be built up from scratch. They didn't have the same languages. They didn't have the same belief system. So that was something that was rebuilt. That's why I say when you talk about black, when people talk about black, they are talking about a specific group, and there is an emergent group in the United States of America. I might say emergent, but they might have existed for a long time, called ADOS, American Descendants of Slaves, who are a specific culture and a specific group within that place. And I think they have specific interests and concerns that I may not completely understand. As I had in a separate video where I said, at most, I just happen to be black. But I don't really identify as strongly with what I think black would actually mean if you actually went down to some foundational level of what that term actually initiated as. Even the term white, I also think that is a specific thing that is starting to develop in the United States of America as the place becomes more as the different places from different European cultures become more homogeneous within the United States of America and intermingle and things like that. But anyway, so one thing is specific here. Is there differences? Did the Europeans say, okay, black people that we've taken from communities that don't hit their kids, despite the fact that still there's other people in Africa that are doing it? But anyway, so you don't hit your kids, but now that you're hitting your kids, we've stopped whooping our kids that we've been brutalizing for centuries, and now our kids are going to do better than your kids. No, so there's other concerns. So when we're tying the racial things here, I'm not quite sure. It's racial, sure, racist, I don't know. So with that, as I mentioned, I'm going to read something right after this about systematic versus systemic, going back to that initial meme that I had talking about, is the actual abuse systemic or systematic? Okay, so implications for professionals. In general, I agree that she's pointing out these things in this thing, and I think it is something that therapists should have. I've seen anecdotally, and I think the actual reports, that in the African American community, in the black community, there's a lower want to actually go into therapy and get that kind of help and talk about certain issues, and that leads to problems. They talked about the black church here. That's the one thing that's tied with Christianity. There's nothing against keeping slaves in Christianity. Exodus chapter 21. There's that whole spare the child, spare the rod, spare the child, even though that is something that was misquoted and turned around, but there's nothing in the Bible that says, oh, you shouldn't hit kids, you shouldn't be disciplined in that way. Religion has been used for that. The spare the rod is more, the rod is a guiding point, a guiding rod, like a stick to guide your way and things like that, and not actually hitting the person. And despite how it came to be and everything, we know it's a key part. There's currently, I don't want to mention this person's name, a situation at Atlanta. Somebody was shot. He was a former criminal, he was a felon, and he was in some situation, and then they burnt down an actual location that he was actually shot at while he was involved in some altercation with the police. And he had this funeral where he was like lauded and things like this, and I'm wondering, why are they lauding this person? And there's certain things about him, but there's hardly any mention about why he was a felon. And it was from hitting his wife. It was from actually hitting his kids to a point where he was actually jailed for that. And it's something where it's not even mentioned. They're just saying, yeah, he was a great guy. And this is one thing I don't like about funerals. This whole thing of just whitewashing everything that happens. Yeah, you can celebrate the person's life, but if you're going to celebrate the person's life, so you got to talk about what they did. And this man was hitting his kids, and that's not cool. This is supposed to message. No, it's not cool. Okay, so implications for professionals. I'm going to finish this and then get off to the systemic and systematic thing, just because I think with this, if you're actually hearing this and you are involved in a situation where maybe you might seek therapy or you might be a professional, I think it's good to get this full information that I said, the links below to this. Cultural competency means that professionals develop the ability to translate and communicate the intersections between historical trauma and the research on child development, the effects of physical discipline on the developing brain, and the connections between family violence and racial disparities in education, foster care, and juvenile justice, all while offering healthier parenting practice alternatives to diverse families. Cultural competency should not be interpreted to mean colluding with families to rely on tactics that decades of research have proven harmful. Professionals should not presume that families of color are so invested in corporal punishment that they are incapable of learning and integrating healthier alternatives into their parenting toolkit. Cultural competency demands advancing the field and informing practitioners about the historical and contemporary racial realities of this country. Okay, small aside. Some of this stuff is just frustrating because they just try to make everything racial, racist, and things like this. And as I've mentioned, this is a regular thing here in Kenya. 95% of people are Negro or genetically. And what is the expense? I guess she might argue that this comes from some kind of past of colonialism or something. I don't know. But I think at least the key part of this, where she's saying, yeah, you break these out, people can learn. I think that's a positive thing. I've tried to have conversations with people here in Kenya about it, and people are not open to the peaceful parenting, to say the least. They'll just proudly, just openly talk about just some real horrendous things they do to children. Psychologists can shift the public discourse around corporal punishment to set a standard of care based on solid evidence that gets translated and communicated effectively to the diverse communities in dire need of healthier parenting practices. The child, the risk to children is far greater than and more important than the fear of alienating parents who often use cultural tradition to defend hitting. Instead of blaming and stigmatizing black parents, professionals can offer information about why the practice is harmful, but have been told it is necessary, and offer healthier alternatives that produce better outcomes for children, families, and communities. Such an approach will support black parents' own parenting goals as they strive for the security and welfare of their children. So I think one interesting thing to do here would be just to go back to these Western African locations that supposedly had this peaceful parenting sort of spiritual look on what children were, and see how they treat children right now in those places. You might find some female child genital mutilation, and I think male child genital mutilation will continue because in most cultures that continue. So there are some questions, but I think it's still something I still think it's a good resource to check it out. And in addition, this is a .org site, so this is a governmental site. This is a thing that has support of the supposed racist government of the United States of America, and they're putting this racial take on it. How much how much actual effort towards protecting children is there in sub-Saharan Africa? How many governmental bodies go into the actual history and studies of why parents are hitting their kids? How much is the government actually involved in that? So there's some things. There's also part of the reason why black people aren't leaving the United States en masse and moving to Africa, because I think subconsciously, and if you actually quiz them and you got to discussing it, relatively most of them would admit that it's a rather good place to live, all things considered. Even if I'm wondering with some of this racial theory and intersectional, when I saw that intersectional, I was like, should I actually read this? That term has just been used in certain ways that I have some reservations against people who use that certain term. Though it seems that if I actually sat down and had a conversation with Stacey Patton, I might come to pretty much full agreement on most of this content. But now moving on to the last reading, and thanks for actually taking your time here. Now, this is from Mental Floss. This is systemic versus systematic. I shall also record this separately for a definition series so I can refer to it without having the preamble of this entire conversation, but getting into it. So, the English language is bursting with pairs of words so similar that you might think they mean the same thing, even if one has extra syllable in the middle. Some actually do mean the same thing. Disoriented, for example, is a version of disoriented, more commonly used in the UK, but they both describe someone who's lost their bearings. Others, like systemic and systematic, have different definitions. According to Dr. Paul Bryans, a former Washington State University English professor and leading authority on grammar, systematic relates to an action that is done according to some systems or organized method. If you sort out M&Ms by color and eat the blue ones last, you are doing it systematically. Sometimes, Brian explains on his website, systematic is used when a behavior, however unintentional it may be, is so habitual that it seems to be a result of a system. If you forget to lock your front door every time you leave the house, someone might say that you have a systematic pattern of forgetfulness. Systemic, meanwhile, describes something that happens inside a system or affects all parts of a system. It's often used in scientific contexts. I wouldn't say like contexts, but it's often used in scientific contexts, especially those that involve disease or pesticides. If cancer is systemic, that means it's presented throughout the body. If you're describing how the cancer progressed, however, you would say that it spread systematically from organ to organ. As Grammarist points out, systemic can denote something that is deeply ingrained in the system, which helps explain why you sometimes hear it in discussion about social or political issues. When Theodore Roosevelt served as New York City Police Commissioner, for example, his main goal was to stamp out the systemic corruption in the police department. In short, systematic is used to describe the way a process is done, while systemic is used to describe something inside a system. So, with this in mind, and a small aside, right now as I'm recording this, there is discussion about taking down Theodore Roosevelt's statue that's in front of the National History Museum in New York City. And he was the mayor of New York City, and that's interesting. This is about police brutality, supposedly these riots and protests and tearing down of these statues, these systemic racism in the United States of America, talking about this topic going back to the slavery, and that's why blacks are beating their kids and all this kind of things. Those are things that are being tied in. But he was actually trying to take down systemic corruption in the police department when he was police commissioner, and now they're tearing down his statue. Kind of interesting there. But okay, so with this one, now what do you think about it? Do you think there's something systemic? Because chattel slavery, in that situation, there is something systemic about slavery that is forceful, that is about taking away somebody's agency, that is abusive. Now, do you think that actually initiated a systematic form of parental child abuse in the black community in the United States of America, or do you think it's systemic within that culture? Does the culture have those roots, pun intended, with that TV series, with Kunta Kinte and things like that, Geordie LaForge? But you have that where that is the actual roots of it, so that is part of it. This culture itself is this tribe called black people systemically built on that force, on that abuse, and that's horrific if it is. And if that is a systemic part of that culture, then let black go to do something new. Because you're talking about this is something that started with white people, but I think if you go back in history and look who started inventing these peaceful parenting techniques that are being taught. And yeah, they're saying, okay, that's what I said, go back to Western Africa and see if those are still there. Will you want us to go back to that kind of parenting? Oh, kids come from this other plane. No, they don't. They don't. We understand that. But there are certain peaceful parenting things. I look at the movements in the peaceful parenting communities. It's mostly white people doing that. It's mostly white people talking about these things. One of the main people I heard this from was like Stefan Molyneux. People might dislike Stefan Molyneux, but he got me onto the peaceful parenting. A lot of other people were involved in that. But this is non-aggression principle. Certain things like these are things that came from white people. So you can also learn these from other people. Let's appropriate positive things from each other because we're all human beings. Like this is a step in the right direction. I can't really fault this person too much. I was just thinking if I had to lie to everyone to let them know about world peace, or we can observe that, would I lie? I don't know. I don't have to buy into the whole reasoning behind this because saying, okay, the blacks learned the beating of kids from white people that also beat their kids, so the blacks aren't necessarily responsible in the sense. I know she didn't say they're not specifically responsible, it's not part of their culture, but then they've seen the negative effect. So could also whites in general and this racism that's saying in the institutional structure, what was the effect of those white parents actually abusing their kids for all that time? So does that absolve them of that? And I'm not saying that was what was said, but there's a lot of confusion here. So whether you want to convince people like, oh, don't do this behavior because you're not actually doing what your African ancestors did, but instead you're copying what the white man did, I think that would be a lesser evil in this case if I had to pick, because it would still result in kids not being hit. The kids might be taking certain things that I consider inaccurate with the origin if you don't have to tell them that this, I mean, just whatever, just don't hit your kids because we're all humans. From the babies to the old people, to the people in the past who did evil things, the people trying to do their best now, the people in Black Lives Matter protesting, from the kid who's supposedly throwing a tantrum but just doesn't know how to communicate, and for the parent who hits the kid because they're frustrated from the different things that are happening in their lives. We're all human beings, but let's find better ways to do these things. So, hashtag peaceful parenting matters. It's part of my Hands Up, Don't Hit series. Thanks for spending your time to listen to this. It's also part of the Black Lives Matter series. You might be able to disagree with me, and there's a lot to discuss with a lot of these things that I do post, but I think one thing that definitely will see more of a correlation. Correlation does not imply causation, but I think it's going beyond. It's going beyond the point where you can't really argue that cultures, communities, people, for whatever reason, that find themselves in situations where they can peaceful parent the kids that come out from those kind of environments. just do better in society, have better lives. And I think that is something we can all agree is something that most of us, I think pretty much anyone listening to this will agree that's a positive thing to strive for in one way or another. Thank you. Goodbye.